Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last lecture in the four-part lecture series on South Asian art after partition. This lecture is going to be covering art and politics. We're going to be looking at female artists, the role of censorship and propaganda in 1980s Pakistan. So, I'd like to begin by giving you some context as to what was happening at this time. Pakistan was newly formed in the 1940s, in the late 1940s, 1947. It just gained independence from India after the departure of the British. And as a result of this, Pakistan went through multiple regime changes. There was at least three or four different presidents who essentially ran the country to the way in which they envisioned the Pakistani nation. And this was no difference in the 1980s. And when the last politician in charge got usurped by a military general by the name of Zia al-Haq in 1977, the socio-cultural fabric of Pakistan, the arts, um, the political sphere of Pakistan was completely changed. During this period, artists, especially women, used their work to comment on the socio-political conditions of what was going on at the time. So, what was happening? General Zia Haq took power, and he had this hardline, orthodox, sort of Islamic jurisprudence-based role in handling the country, and as a result, he used a lot of totalitarian um, methods for control, and one of these was censorship. So all forms of media at this time was censored. Things like art, literature, news, movies, music, all of this was channeled and funneled through censorship channels. And as a result of this, a lot of artists had to go underground, and a lot of dissent against the state or the popular narrative had to be done hush hush. And writers like Faiz, Iqbal Ahmed, Yasser Arafat, who silently resisted the regime and were actually pushed by the regime, eventually also came under scrutiny for their socialist ideals. And a lot of artists actually started to um, support these socialist and reform changes that they wanted in the government. So what was Zia al-Haq actually doing at the time? He enforced martial law and censorship, so a lot of freedom of expression was completely censored. Artists, writers, intellectuals faced constant surveillance and restriction. Many artists, their work was actually completely either destroyed or it was not allowed to be shown in public. He had these Islamization policies, so he was also changing the way in which the country handled jurisprudence and law. So he enforced this very orthodox Islam inspired sort of law, and there was a lot of gender segregation happening. There was a lot of the veiling of women and the hudud ordinances, which was this sort of draconian set of laws that were in place that stripped the rights of women. And the suppression of women's rights, what was going on at the time, was pretty much what sparked the feminist movement. And one of these key movements, these key bodies in this movement was the Women's Action Forum, and this was actually formed in 1981 in response to these hudud ordinances and these draconian laws, these sort of archaic laws that Zia al-Haq's regime was essentially enforcing upon the citizens of Pakistan. So we have this military dictator of huge pomp and regalia. He looks a bit like a Star Wars villain, and he comes into power, and what's happening is he's using corporal punishment and fear tactics to control people, and he's pushing all of the art and culture and social cohesion underground. And as a result of this, through whatever channel or whatever sort of backlash, one fine day when he was coming back from a meeting in his private airplane, along with a envoy of U.S. ambassadors, somebody slipped a hand grenade into a crate of mangoes, and that was that. That was the end of Zia al-Haq. So while all of this was happening from 1977 to 1981, there was this huge resistance against the regime, and a lot of this was done through art. So a lot of artists at this time were using a lot of symbolism. They avoided overt messages to escape censorship, and instead they used things like metaphor, allegory, and personal iconography. A lot of these artists also ventured into abstraction because they could hide or at least veil the meaning or the intention of what their art was trying to do, so it could evade censorship. A lot of artists at the time were also exploring the female body as a political site. So a lot of women artists began to challenge and push back from the state's control over gender roles and identities. And women at this time, they did not like how they were being policed by the state. Other artists, they started looking back at the traditional Mughal miniature painting as a point of reference, as a point of subversion. And we've seen in the previous lectures how miniature painting was created by those who were in power, and how miniature painting became a political tool, like in which we see the company paintings by the British East Indian Company when they were colonizing this area. So, what artists can we dive into? So, we're going to look at the work of Salima Hashmi and Lala Rukh. These are two key players in the Women's Action Forum, and also key players in the arts and cultural progression of Pakistan. Other notable mentions, Iftikhar Dadi and Elizabeth Dadi, these are really wonderful academians. They actually archive and explore the visual culture of nationalism and imagery. They have one of the largest bodies of research on this, and they also write these wonderful biographies. One of the writers, and one of the artists that we covered in the last lecture, AJ Shamsa. There's a really wonderful book by Iftikhar Dadi that covers his life and work. Other artists like Sherzad Alam, they make these wonderful ceramics. They're more Asian inspired, and they reclaim traditional craft during a time of cultural homogenization. And this was something that Zia wanted to do. He wanted to create this one unified body of culture, this one unified body of socio-religious expression, either through calligraphy or painting. And this is just something that was completely against what Pakistan was going through at the time. We had this, multicultural, multi-religious nation that was just born, and a lot of artists began pushing back against this homogenization that was happening. Other key figures that were more popular in the 90s and late 80s, figures like Zuhur al-Akhlaq, who essentially revived miniature painting with a modern content. He trained an entire generation of artists like Shazi Sikandar, Imran Qureshi, and Rashid Rana. He was one of the key figures in the later movement in the late 80s and early 90s. Similarly, we have Shazia Sikandar, who again used miniature painting to include feminist and political ideas. She peaked in her career in the late 1990s, and a lot of her work can still be seen today. We're going to be covering just two of these artists, however. We're going to be covering Salima Hashmi, we're going to be covering Lala Rukh. And one of the key centers, the key bodies of where all of this was happening was the National College of Arts in Lahore. This place, NCA, became a crucible for political and experimentation in the visual arts. And of course, we have the Women's Action Forum. This was a large grouping, a grassroots movement of women that came together and started to resist the regime in protest and in direct action and in art and in writing. And all these artists, writers, and designers, they came together and made these amazing posters, banners, performances, and protest material. So here's a group photo of the Women's Action Forum, which was founded in the 1980s. And here we have, in this picture, right in the center, we have one of our artists that we're going to be looking at today. This is Lala Rukh. And Lala Rukh was one of the key founding members of the Women's Action Forum. Here's another photo of a protest that was actually stopped midway on the Mall Road in Lahore. And in an act of protest, all of these women, they started burning their chadars. Of course, the chadar, the veil, is such a powerful image in South Asia. But we know that in this, it was an act of defiance. It was an act of going against what was happening, the forced veiling of women. And here on the far left, we actually see Lala Rukh also burning her chadar. Here's another wonderful image of a protest against Zia's regime. These people are coming out with placards and cartoons and caricatures. Here's a caricature of some kind of Maulvi figure, and Zia al Haq here looks a bit uh, like sort of like a villain from a cartoon almost. And in the back we have these placards with all these slogans, and one of them reads, "Implementation of Sharia system is unacceptable." So we can see how all these people are going against the Islamization policies of Zia's regime. So we're going to look at some of Lala's work and see how Lala Rukh was contributing to this movement. And Lala Rukh was actually trained as a painter, as a printmaker, and a lot of her work began to explore uh, how women can be emancipated from the shackles of patriarchy and patriarchal oppression. So this poster here, Masawi Hukuk, was made for the Women's Action Forum in the early 1980s. It was printed on an offset print. And you can see how Lala is using this really wonderful, simplified graphic design and utilizing this calligraphy within the design. And Lala actually trained as a calligrapher as well. She was one of her main methods of regaining her cultural heritage was this training in calligraphy. And this poster is very reminiscent of the images that were coming out of Iran in the late 1960s when the fall of the Shah and the implementation of Ayatollah Khomeini and his school of thought was happening. And Ziaul Haq actually was really inspired by this. This was one of the main inspirations for Zia's regime, seeing what was happening in Iran. He wanted to replicate something here within a South Asian context. So you can see how Lala has used this wonderful imagery here to evoke this really powerful poster. This is one of her more famous works, and this is Crimes Against Women, in which she has compiled all of these uh, articles from newspapers of what is happening against women. Ziaul Haq was very open about how he is creating this utopian Islamic society using Islamic laws. But we know behind closed doors that the violence and oppression against women was skyrocketing. And this was all being seen in the newspapers. While the newspapers were, of course, controlled by uh, Zia's regime, the printing press was actually something that was completely controlled. You could not print your own media. Despite all of this, she has collected all of these numerous titles and headlines in which women have been killed or harassed or of course, assaulted. And she's created this composition showcasing all of this. And this is one of the main posters used for the Women's Action Forum campaign. Here's another sort of calendar that's been designed by Lala. You can see her wonderful, powerful sort of graphic design knowledge. There's this really amazing hierarchy of image and text that's happening. To talk about printing, because printing commercially was censored or heavily controlled through the regime, Lala actually began to use printing methods and printing workshops in her own home in order to empower women to create more art. So she actually had all of these workshops in which she would help women print these posters either through a silkscreen printing or an offset printing method. And this wonderful print that we see here of a poster was actually designed in Bangladesh. And later it was printed in a workshop at a women's center in Sargodha. So you can see this really powerful men, money, and morality, the unholy trinity. Seeing this, the main driver for all of the ills in the world, and we have this figure that sort of comprises of all of the major religions that are present in the region. So we have Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and even Sikhism we have here, Christianity with this cross here, and he's holding these prayer beads, this monk almost. But Lala has wonderfully sort of uh, reprinted this and um, imagined it through her series of prints in which she did at Sargodha. Here's another flyer for one of their get togethers. You can see all of these images from previous protests in which women have been harassed or the public have been charged at by the state's police. And Lala has used this in her poster to make a really evocative design. Finally, moving on to Lala's own personal work, Lala Rook was quite private about her life, and she didn't overtly explain her work. She left it open to interpretation for the viewer. For the people who are very close to Lala Rook, she was quite candid, and she opened up very much and liked to talk about different things and different aspects of her work. But to us, the viewer, she would like to keep things quite mysterious. And this series, Hieroglyphics, Koi Aashik Kisi Mehbooba Se, is this really wonderful a veiled image almost, and it explores writing as um, an image rather than a content, something that is to be read. And this series sort of reminds me of really early asemic writing works, which I'm quite interested in actually. My own work is highly inspired by a lot of this work. Lala then began to experiment quite a lot with her work, and in the late 1990s, she began to use things like photocopying and crayon and mixed media in order to make her works. And her works have this very dark and mysterious quality about them. There's some kind of image that's hidden within this image. Perhaps it's an image of a building, or perhaps it's of a headline. And this use of headlines is something that's um, going to be used by Lala Rook quite a lot in these works. And when we see her later works, this later series of what she referred to as mirror images, we see this building. It could be some kind of masjid, or it could be some kind of government building. And we have here this text. Again, we have the word masjid. On the left here, we have this sort of faded out, grayed out image of a what looks to be a newspaper. We can see there's some kind of text, there's some kind of delineation of columns, of paragraphs, and in the back we have this destroyed building. Perhaps Lala is giving us an insight into the dark and very brutal side of our social sphere. Finally, Lala began to experiment with calligraphy and what calligraphy meant as a way in which to reclaim one's liberation. And we know Lala's father was actually involved in the music industry. Lala's father was one of the founding members of the All Pakistani Music Conference, which heavily promoted indigenous and South Asian forms of music. And Lala actually trained under many music ustads, and she began to experiment with this hybrid language between calligraphy, between music, and within video. So we have this really wonderful video installation by the name of Rupak, which is the name of a tal, an Indian classical Indian music tal, a seven tal, and the cuts which are used in calligraphy are wonderfully used as musical notation. And Lala uses this in a really amazing way to showcase uh, this hybridization of language, of movement, and of course, music. Okay, now we move on to the work of Salima Hashmi. Salima Hashmi was the daughter of a very famous Pakistani poet by the name of Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And Faiz Ahmed Faiz had very uh, hardline, left wing political, socio political views. And he expressed a lot of these views in his writings and in his poetry. His poetry is often alluding to ideas of freedom, of things that are happening in society, pushing against totalitarianism, and also pushing towards a more harmonious or a human aspect to society. And Salima Hashmi, of course, was inspired by this. It's no doubt that her father was one of the greatest inspirations for her political and socio-political ideas, and her involvement in the Women's Action Front was one of great importance because she spearheaded a lot of the pedagogical and educational fronts. She was actually the VC of National College of Arts, Lahore, for at least a decade, and she continued to teach for over 30 years. And a lot of her ideas and her ways of image making and her ideas and philosophies behind image making were something that were um, would greatly influence the socio-political and cultural climate of Pakistani art. So we have this image by Salima Hashmi painted in the early 1980s called Birthday Girl, and it shows this composition which reminds us of very early um, flat, planar compositions found in miniature painting. But we have this really wonderful nude figure in the back that looks very vulnerable. It's a figure of a woman. She's sort of crouched over, and in front we have some kind of shadow. It looks almost like a tripod of a camera that is looking at her, and she's shying away. And uh, this image has this sort of twofold layered perspective of what's happening. And then at the very, very front, we have this newspaper clipping that's pasted in here, and it says 100 good food years. So when we look into this term, 100 good food years, it's actually a phrase that's commonly used to portray extreme optimism and extreme providence when it comes to a country that's developing. When you say good food years, it means that you have a really, really, really bountiful future ahead of you. And Salima Hashmi very cleverly uses this as a counterpoint of what's happening behind closed doors. And it's, of course, the exploitation and the vulnerability of women within the system. So this layered approach that Salima Hashmi uses will be used throughout her work. And if we move on to the next image called The Water Song Ends, we can see how cleverly she's began to include the figure in this layered composition. We have the background, we have these sort of tiles of what could perhaps be a building, we have this red sky, we have another wall that's coming in here. But if we look very carefully behind this door frame and between this wall, we have a reclining female figure, and she's almost blending into the background. Perhaps this is a commentary on how women are being perceived in society. And if we look very carefully, we can see another newspaper cutout of uh, what looks to be a woman in agony. And this perhaps might be from a newspaper headline of the 1960s in Iran. We have this woman clad in this niqab or burqa. And Salima Hashmi will use a lot of this imagery in her work. We will see in the other series, in the other works, of how she uses this really wonderful background and foreground composition. And in her work here, Fugitive Moon, the female body, as we've talked about, being a site for political um, experimentation and investigation. In this image, Fugitive Moon, Salima Hashmi has hidden this female figure into the landscape, sort of creating this idea of how important women are to our social and cultural fabric. Um, we know terms like Mother Nature and even in South American cultures of how women are perceived to be uh, one of the more important aspects of nature, and the divine feminine is essential to life existing on Earth. And Salima Hashmi has created this really wonderful abstract composition in which this nude female figure is part of the environment. She's part of this earthen um, sediment, almost like sedimentation that's happening around her. Similarly, Salima Hashmi in this painting, Morning Paper, has done very much the same, but in this case, the woman is sort of blended into her domestic environment, this reclining nude on her bed, the face not visible, is sort of part of the image. And perhaps this is also because Salima wants to not overtly portray the nude female body. Perhaps at this time, because of censorship, she was not allowed to actually show these works of overt uh, nude women. And if we look very carefully again, we can see this newspaper that's becoming a very common motif in her work, and it's something to do with Beirut at the time. Perhaps this is to cover what was happening um, in and around that region at the time. We know that in the 1980s and the late 1970s, the Soviets had actually invaded Afghanistan, and a lot of the world was very apprehensive of what was happening in the region. And we know that General Zia al-Haq was actually training a lot of freedom fighters, or what he would call freedom fighters, also known as the Mujahideen, to go and fight against the Russians in Afghanistan. And this caused a lot of turbulence in the region. And while the Afghani people reclaimed their freedom from the Soviet Empire, it ultimately led to the rise of multiple terror cells and also very, very shaky politics within the region. This critique of militarism is something that began to really intrigue Salima Hashmi. And in this painting, The Water Song Ends, we can see again there's this female body that's hidden, there is architecture and landscape and doors and windows, but there's also this image of these jets, these newly found images of jets, which is probably a critique of what was happening in Afghanistan at the time. And again, Salima Hashmi was one of the more vocal opponents of the militarization of society. And she still continues to be a voice against nuclear weaponry and using nuclear energy for the wrong means. Here's another image, Despite the Daggers by Salima Hashmi. And in this image, the female form is more overt. We can see it's more clear, but it's sort of juxtaposed against all of these wonderful shapes and mark making exercises that are happening. We have this billowing gray smoke and this almost like wonderful tapestry like motif that's happening in the bottom left hand register of the image. And in the very top half of the smoke, we have these hands, and perhaps these hands refer to how women are assaulted or they're touched inappropriately amongst society. And Salima Hashmi does not back down from this political narrative. In all of her work, there's this overarching theme of how women are portrayed, viewed, and um, sort of treated in society. And she really wants to push back against that. She wants to reclaim the female body for what it is and give us an insight as to what's happening in the world around us. Finally, we have this painting, A Poem for Zainab by Salima Hashmi, which was painted in the early 1990s. And this image is in response to a horrific incident of domestic abuse and murder of a woman by her husband. And this image sort of portrays the fear, the disgust, the horror of what Salima Hashmi has witnessed on the news. And while this is post Zaya al Haq, she does not back down from her um, relentless fight against female oppression at the hands of the patriarchal regimes. And as you can see, she has wonderfully utilized this newspaper cutout of a woman whose mouth is shut. And Salima Hashmi is making this very poignant reminder of how women still do not have the adequate place in society and how their suffering still continues, regardless of who is in charge. Finally, we can sort of conclude this by discussing the collective efforts of the WAF. They essentially allowed for the overturning of major laws. Without their protests, without their work, without the artists and the writers, we would not have the greater rights, the free speech, and equality for women across South Asia. Their tireless efforts in major sectors of society helped countless citizens. If it wasn't for them, then many of these laws would not have been overturned, and as a result, women would not have their place in society today, not just in Pakistan but across South Asia. Salima Hashmi and Lala Rukh contributed not only to the arts but also to pedagogy. We know that Salima Hashmi was VC of NCA for over a decade, but very little is known about Lala Rukh. Lala Rukh inspired an entire generation of artists through a very innovative Masters of Visual Arts program at the National College of Arts, which started in 2006. And this program was actually started in order to sort of help bachelor students unlearn many things that they had been taught in bachelor's programs and perhaps allow them to explore and experiment with not just mediums but also with ideas and philosophies. I'm very privileged that I got to be a part of this program, and this program still continues today. It's still thriving very strongly. The WAF continues to serve as an inspiration for countless female artists in Pakistan and elsewhere. It also continues to support the emancipation of women for patriarchal rule and continues to voice the voiceless. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this lecture series. It was a great privilege to teach all of you, and I hope you learned a lot of different things and new things. And I really hope you enjoyed these lectures. Thank you so much for being part of this. Take care. Bye bye.